Hello, welcome to tonight's vodcast for Tuesday, November 16th, the effects of the Revolutionary War. Um, as you remember from a couple of weeks ago when we looked at cause and effect, effects are things that happen after an event. So we looked at all of the causes of the Revolutionary War, such as the British taxes, not having a say in the government, and unfair treatment. Those are all causes of the Revolutionary War. And today we're going to look at what the effects of the Revolutionary War ended up being. Next slide. So first, let's look at some of the reasons that the Americans won. And there are four reasons. The first reason is that they had better leadership. The British were overconfident and made costly mistakes. We read about some of the generals that took too long to get to where they needed to be, about celebrating too much, and really about just taking for granted that they were going to win the war. It reminds us a lot of the story, the tortoise and the hare, where the British, in this case, would be the tortoise, would be the hare, and the Americans would be the tortoise. So those are some of the reasons why they won. Another reason was that George Washington was able to adapt. We've talked about that word earlier. It'll be one of your vocabulary words. That based on what he saw in the war and what he experienced, he was able to change. We saw some of those changes with the guerrilla warfare. We saw some of those changes with the way that they would attack certain cities or not attack certain cities, whereas the British pretty much used the same strategy the entire time, and that ends up costing them. Another huge reason that the Americans won was foreign aid. And most people say that without the help of France and Spain, there's no way the Americans win this war. We looked at the Battle of Yorktown, that a main reason we were able to win at the Battle of Yorktown was because of the French Navy. Without that Navy, there's no way we win. So that the foreign aid is a big piece. Next slide. The third reason, many of you talked about it when you were doing your debates, was just the knowledge of the land, that the Americans knew the land much better than the British, and they were able to keep any land that they took control of, whereas the British generally lost that land. And the final reason, which can't be overstated, is motivation. The Americans wanted to win this war at any cost. Whereas the British, most of the British citizens said, yeah, if we win, great. If not, no big deal. Motivation is usually the reason why we succeed or we fail. Whether it's grades, whether it's homework, whether it's battles, whether it's the Revolutionary War. If you really want something, you're going to do it. In your notebooks, I want you to choose one of these four reasons and tell me which one you think was the biggest reason that we won. And tell me why. Next slide. So, as we know, at the end of each war, there's always a treaty. And a treaty, it's a vocabulary word from a while ago, but it is a formal agreement where two sides agree to stop fighting. In your notebook, I want you to tell me how many years later was the treaty signed. So you have to look at what year the Revolutionary War ended, and then how many years went by until they signed this treaty. And the treaty was signed in 1783. And there are 6 conditions, or in a legal document we call them clauses. So they agree on these 6 conditions. The first is that the U.S. is independent. They're no longer part of Britain. Britain needs to acknowledge them as their own country. The second, it sets the U.S.'s boundaries as the Mississippi River on the west, Canada on the north, and Florida, which is controlled by Spain, on the south. And I'll show you a map of that in a couple of moments. The third clause is that the United States is allowed to fish off of Canada's Atlantic coast. This might seem kind of funny. Oh, yeah, you guys get to wear funny pants and boots and go fishing. But some of the most important fish for food was up by present-day Maine and Canada, by Nova Scotia. And the Americans knew that without being able to fish there, they were going to have a really hard time getting food. So they were very adamant that they get that right. The fourth is that each side agrees to pay any debts that they owe. So if you owned a business before the Revolutionary War and you owed the bank in Britain £5,000, you agreed you would still pay the £5,000. The fifth clause is that the British agreed to return any slaves that they had captured or freed. Wait for that truck to go by. And the sixth clause is that Congress would recommend, not force, but recommend that the states return any property taken from loyalists. So remember, during the war, a lot of loyalists fled because they were afraid what might happen to them. And the states pretty much took over their property. So in the clause, Britain wants to make sure that the loyalists know that they are appreciative of their loyalty and that they've got their back. And that's something a lot of you mentioned in your debate that they would do. So good job, being able to read into advance on that. Next slide. Here's a map. You could see this is all of the land gained by the Treaty of Paris. So along the left, which is the western side, you could see the Mississippi River. Everything west of that is pretty much owned by France. All of the area in pink, though, now becomes America. And you can see how much bigger it is than the original 13 colonies. It goes all the way past the Appalachian Mountains, and America almost triples its size with this treaty. And then you can see in the south that Florida is still controlled by Spain. Next slide. So let's look at the costs of this war. And first we're going to look at it in terms of deaths. I know it's not a fun thing to talk about, but it is a part of war. The British lost about 10,000 soldiers. The Americans, in comparison, lost 25,700. It's a huge difference. If we look in terms of money, the new Congress did not have money to pay the soldiers during or after the war. So they fight for months or for years for their country, and now they're kind of they go back home without any money. So most of them end up becoming very poor. And America as a country is left with about $27 million of debt, which back then is a lot of money. $27 million, a lot of money back then. And if you look at the chart over at the right, I've broken down for you the deaths. We don't have a breakdown for British, so we'll just say that they're from fighting. But if you look at the American side, in your notebook, I want you to tell me which of those three reasons contributed to American deaths the most. Deaths from being in prison, deaths from starvation, cold, or disease, or deaths from fighting. So I want you to answer that question in your notebook. And tomorrow in class, we're going to be looking at some of the math behind it. Next slide. Your final assessment, there are two for today. The first, I want you to pretend that you are either an American or British ambassador, which is the same as being a representative. After drafting this document, if you're handed it, the Treaty of Paris, would you accept these 6 terms or no? So would you look at this document and say, as a British representative or as an American representative, I agree with this document and I will follow it? Or would you change things about it? Would you say, no, you're not giving up enough, or hey, we're giving up too much? Would you accept it or not, and tell me why? And then I want you to write down one question that you need clarification on from this lesson. It can either be something you need clarification on or you're curious and would like more information about. But one question that you have from this unit. Both of these can also be found on the website. There's 2 different forums. One is the question and one is the British ambassador. So you can either do this on binder paper or on the website. Look forward to seeing you guys tomorrow, and I hope you have a great night.